Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 25th of July of 2023. But before we start discussing the situation on the ground, of course, we must discuss the most important updates that currently are coming from Moscow. To be more precise, from the Russian parliament. As you know, maybe not, that this week and the previous week there were a lot of discussions about the upcoming laws that the Russian parliament is going to adopt. And these laws are completely connected with the upcoming or possible mobilization process. And mainly the Russian deputies were talking about and currently are talking about the penalties that people will pay if they don't support, if they break the law about the mobilization. I'll give you a few examples just for better understanding. For example, if Russian military authorities require some help from some people to help them and to support them, to provide some support in the mobilization process, and if a person doesn't give such kind of support, he will have to pay $5,000 penalties. If, for example, Russian military authorities required some person to visit mobilization required recruitment center, and if a person doesn't come, then this person needs to pay penalty around $500. So a lot of different things. And the Russians are talking about the new wave of mobilization. Almost every single person in Russia currently talks about this situation. And as I understand that soon the Russians are going to launch another wave. And according to pieces of information we have, for example, the Western sources reported that recently the Russians have bought and signed a contract with China for buying for around few hundred thousands of body armors. Of course, as I understand, these body armors is not going to be provided to the current army, because everybody in Russia have already this body armor. As I understand, the Russians are currently building plans for building a new army. And as I understand, this mobilization the Russians are going to launch very soon, because during August and September, the Russians at least 2 months need to spend to train people. And only after 2 months of trainings, they will be able to send them to the combat line. And based one more time on the report piece of information that the Russians have signed the contracts with the Chinese companies for more than a few hundred thousands of body armors, I understand that the Russians are going to mobilize up to 500,000 army. And this very big army, and of course, this army can break the situation, we understand this, but when talking about the real Russian situation, or situation on the ground, we understand that the Russians don't need 500,000 army in Zaporizhzhia, in Kherson, or in Donetsk, on Kupyansk, on Lyman, because the army that the Russians have is enough to defeat the Ukrainians, to hold the positions, and sometimes even to counterattack. And we can see the situation, the Russian successful counterattacks, at least on the Kupyansk and Lyman front lines. So that means that the Russians are going to mobilize another 500,000 army for other purposes. And probably, as I understand, this is my complete speculation, that probably the Russians will try to, with the next wave of mobilization, they will try to reinforce the Russian army on the western border. Not of Russia, but of Union government, Union authority, Union power of Belarus and Russian Federation. So basically the Russians will try to reinforce their forces in this area. And probably that was the reason why the Russians have already redeployed Wagners on the western border, just to not to allow the Poland and Baltic states and NATO countries to feel themselves comfortable. So the Russians have already started redeployment process. Now they will launch mobilization, and after that they will send, I'm not sure that 500,000 army they're going to send to the western border. They need for this purposes just a few hundred thousand soldiers, because Belarus has their army themselves, there is Wagner's, and another 200 is going to be a very nice picture. And as I understand, the next 300,000 soldiers the Russians will try to redeploy to the northern areas of Ukraine, to Chernihiv and Sumy area. And based on this, my understanding, the Russians will try to attack after the next wave of mobilization in the direction of Kiev from the northeast. Probably this is going to be the main Russian direction during the next upcoming winter campaign. A military campaign, they will try to capture Kiev, to encircle Kharkiv with the newly created army. And some part of that army will be redeployed to the western borders, and just not to allow the western countries and the NATO to enter the western part of Ukraine. Because if they enter, the Russians, using newly created army, will attack the western countries' native army from the north. Furthermore, don't forget, for example, today the Western sources published the video of redeployment of Polish forces to the north, and this is the small probably battalion of forces. One battalion was moved to the north in the area between, let's say, Lithuania and Poland, in the area between Kaliningrad region, the Kaliningrad Oblast, the part of Russian Federation, and Belarus. And currently the Ukrainians, the Western countries, the NATO countries, are trying to increase their presence in this area, and probably even I expect that somehow to make the life worse for Belarus and Russia, they will even block this territory, and they will cut any supply and support of Kaliningrad as a part of blackmail to stop the special military operation. And of course, if NATO countries are going to do this, the Russians need to have a lot of army, a very big army in this area to prevent these very bad relations, very bad actions from the NATO countries. Now let's move to the situation on the ground. Let's discuss, because we also got a lot of updates. Probably as a result of drone attacks and missiles attacks, the Russians managed to destroy a very important bridge that located on the western part of Ukraine. The Russian sources are saying that using that bridge, the western countries were redeploying their forces to Ukraine, to the mainland from Romania, basically from the NATO countries. And this is a strategically important bridge, and nobody knows how much time the Ukrainians need to restore, to recover, to build, because we see the damage. That bridge was damaged heavily. Now we are moving to the south, to Kherson area. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fightings on this area, the Ukrainians lost 60 soldiers, 10 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system Akatsiya. Currently, there are very fierce fightings along the islands between the banks of Dnipro River, and of course very powerful artillery duels. If you remember, yesterday we got the video how the Russians managed to destroy the Spanish air defense system. Also, the Ukrainians published the video how they just continue their drone hunting after the Russian forces on the Russian side of the Dnipro River. And on this video we see how the Ukrainians managed to destroy the Russian radar that the Russians were using to track and discover Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Kazatska, and let's say on Berislav and so on. Now we're moving to the Zaporizhzhia area, and first we're going to start with Petykhatki, with Zhiribets area. Today we got very interesting video from the Russian sources. In this video we see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions along the front lines. Basically, we're going to use this video just to geolocate the real Ukrainian positions. So a few days ago, if you remember, the Russians reported that they launched counter-offensive operation in the vicinity of Kupyansk, but probably that was either some kind of speculation or just the Russians maintained the gray zone, because when talking about the fields on the south of that settlement, the fields is under complete Ukrainian control. Now we are moving to the Bradley Square. Today we got more videos from this bridgehead, but as I understand, the battle has ended. The Battle of Robotina has ended. Today we got very interesting video, and this video was published by the Russian sources. We see probably a Russian soldier, not Ukrainian one, and he was moving along the cemetery of Max Pro armored vehicles of United States production. You see, and probably that took place somewhere in this area in the vicinity of Robotina. This video is not accurately geolocated, but we saw a lot of videos with the same thing when the Russians were bombing and attacking the accumulation of Ukrainian forces. So I have put this icon here because of the most fierce fightings and clashes took place exactly in this area. The Russians continue publishing more and more videos of Lancet strikes against the Ukrainian forces in this area. A lot of Bradleys, a lot of Challengers, a lot of tanks were destroyed. Not Challengers, my bad, the Leopard tanks and so on. We still haven't seen Challengers on the battlefield. And there's more videos coming from this small arc in the field about destroyed tanks, and this is the Leopard tank, and he was attacked by this T-64, my bad, that was destroyed as a result of attack of the drone. We have videos of Ukrainian movements along the fields. Ukrainian Bradleys were moving from one side to another. The Russians were bombing them heavily, and lots of armored vehicles were destroyed. This is a real cemetery. This is probably the second Bradley Square, and of course we had more videos of the Ukrainian losses. So basically the Ukrainians were defeated. The Russians were using their Ka-52 Lancet drones and so on, and the Ukrainians, if someone were able to survive, they moved to the north as close as possible to Novodanilovka. The Russians still controls, and the control over Robotina still remains under the Russians. When talking about the Ukrainian artillery forces, to be more precise, when talking about the Ukrainian 44th Artillery Brigade, of course they were trying to help the Ukrainians as much as possible, and they were bombing and shelling the Russian positions in Verbovo, in the vicinity of Tarasovka and Novopokrovka. For example, in this video we see how the forces of Chechen battalion Sheikh Mansour established their mortar position, and from these mortar positions, they were trying to bomb and attack the Russian forces in the small settlement by the name of Novopokrovka. This is just a video to show the geolocation and probably to show the real Russian positions. This video doesn't show us any results of that attack. When talking about Verbovo, the forces of 44th Artillery Brigade, as I understand, or probably of 38th, yes, it's 47th Artillery Brigade, yes. They managed to discover the Russian ammo depot in Verbovo, and after that, as a result of artillery strike, they destroyed that ammo depot, and as you can see, the Russians were trying to save their lives, and even the dog was trying to save its life, and the dog was even faster than the Russians. When talking about this area, a little bit to the east from the artillery strike, this ammo depot, the Ukrainians managed to destroy the Russians' radar that the Russians were using as a part of electronic warfare. Of course, very important part of the special military operation and very important part of any clashes for any bridgehead. And that's it about this area, about Petykhatki, about Bradley Square. When talking about Vremivka tactical bridgehead, after a few attempts from the Ukrainian side to attack Staromayorska, they stopped, and currently they're trying to do the same thing as the Ukrainians on the Bradley Square. They're trying to bomb and discover Russian positions, because during the previous attacks, the Russians discovered their positions, they shown their hidden positions. The Ukrainians managed to calculate, I believe, a lot of data, and currently they're just working with the data they got during the previous attack, and they're bombing and shelling the Russian positions. From the other side, the Russians also attack and try to destroy the Ukrainian positions, that Ukrainian forces, and so on. Now we're moving further to Donetsk, and by the way, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fightings on the Donetsk and on the Zaporizhzhia and Ugledar area, South Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost 140 soldiers, 7 tanks, and 5 artillery systems. So as you can see, the level of losses is very heavy. But not so heavy in comparison with the previous days, because if you remember, yesterday, according to the Russians, the Ukrainians lost at least 5 tanks. Yes, on the 23rd of July, the Ukrainians lost a lot of armored vehicles, around 30, including 7 Leopards and 15 armored vehicles, including 10 Bradleys. Now we are moving to Donetsk front line. There are also very heavy clashes in this area. The Russians published the video of attacking the Ukrainian positions using drones, and the Russians have redeployed some kind of squad of Lancet forces. And for example, in this video, we see how the Russians managed to discover and destroy Ukrainian tank on this bridgehead. Now we're moving further, and now we're going to talk about Krasnohorivka. The Russian sources reported that today the Russians launched offensive operation in the direction of Krasnohorivka. We discussed this in previous videos, and as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to got very close to that settlement, but as I understand, without any results, because for now we yet haven't received any video or photo confirmation of any results. The only thing we got is that as a result of artillery duels, the Russians destroyed and attacked the Ukrainian artillery system, and that artillery system was located in the vicinity of Krasnohorivka. So as you can see, the Russians managed to discover and to destroy the Ukrainian artillery system that the Ukrainians were using to supply and support their forces during their attack against coal mine. Furthermore, the Ukrainians published another episode of Battle for the Coal Mine. On this video, we see how the Ukrainians managed to discover the Russian positions inside the industrial area of coal mine, and after that they start dropping grenades to the small building trying to get the Russians. We haven't received any updates whether that attack was successful or not. Now we're moving further, and currently we're going to discuss probably the most interesting and the most important part of the frontline, Klishchiivka. The Battle of Klishchiivka continues. The Ukrainians are pushing with everything they have, and as a result of very bloody offensive operations, of very bloody, not even many attempts to attack the settlement, the Russians were forced to step back. For now, yet we see, according to my map, these areas, at least the half of this area, still remains under Russian control. But as I understand, the Russians were forced to step back completely. And I'm not saying that Ukrainians entered this territory. I believe that currently Klishchiivka is the battlefield, and this settlement, nobody, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians, are able to establish normal control over this territory. This morning video we discussed the episode from battle in this area, how the Russians Marines were landed and they were got into a small ambush and the Ukrainians started attacking them from many sides. Then there was an episode of that video showing that a lot of Russian soldiers were killed as a result of that offensive operation. As soon as the Russians realized and understood that the southern and the western part of Klishchiivka fell, the Russians started bombing and shelling these territory with all types of weapons they have, with flamethrower systems, with artillery shells, and of course the Ukrainians had a lot of losses and some forces were forced to step back. Furthermore, some Ukrainian sources reported, to be more precise, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine reported that Ukrainians launched offensive operation in the direction of Andreevka, and as a result of that attack they managed to capture on or to enter that settlement, and that the Ukrainians entered the settlement and the Russians were forced to step back. Yet we haven't received any real confirmations, video of confirmation of that, but anyway, I expect that this is also going to be a part of Ukrainian offensive operation, and there are very high chances that the Russians will be forced to step back from this area as well. The artillery Russian forces try to help the Russian forces as much as possible, and for example in this video we see how the Russians managed to discover Ukrainian artillery position and the ammo depot, and as a result of artillery strike they managed to destroy them. The Ukrainians are not sleeping as well. From their side, Ukrainians are trying to attack with the weapon they have, and probably they're very successful in that attack. On this video we see how the Ukrainians managed to discover Russian checkpoint stronghold, and using drones the Ukrainians just bomb and attack this area. And the Russians, of course, as a result of those clashes, were forced to step back and to leave the stronghold, and were forced to step back towards the north, towards the Artyomovsk, and so on. Furthermore, the Ukrainians made a few attempts to attack Russian positions on the south, in direction of Kurdyumovka and in direction of Azaryanovka. Those attacks were repelled by the Russians, and the Ukrainians during those attacks lost a lot of soldiers. They not lost soldiers, they lost few armored personal carriers. There was 4 that started that operation, and probably just 2 of them ended that operation and managed to survive. The rest of the forces was destroyed. Anyway, we understand that, and if you ask my opinion, this situation with Klishchiivka is a normal situation. Nobody should expect that the Russians are able to hold this bridgehead, not because of the fact that they're masked, because that it's a part of war. And you can't always win and you can't always lose. It's a war. And sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not. Sometimes you are more professional than your enemy, and sometimes enemy is more professional than you. So I expect that the Russians will be forced to step back from Klishchiivka, and the question is where exactly the Russians will try to hold and to keep the Ukrainian forces, because the next defense belt is the railroad ways. It's also very difficult, like barrier to cross, and the Ukrainians will be forced to spend a lot of time and energy to cross this area. And the question what I have is, what exactly is going on with the next bridgehead? And I'm talking about the area between Adaryanovka, Nikolaevka and Nikolaevka Druga, about this area, whether the Russians were able to prepare the defense line in this area, because currently this is the most important part of Artyomov's defense operation. If the Russians during the previous weeks were able to protect this territory, to let's say to increase the strongholds, to create more trenches, then they will be able to repel the Ukrainians' attacks. But if they waste the time, and if Ukrainians are able to capture the settlements, of course, there are going to be more problems for the Russians. And Ukrainians will achieve operational square, and after that they will be able to develop and to stretch their attack in many directions to the north. Let's say from this bridgehead, the Ukrainians will be able to attack in the direction of Opytna, Ivangrad. The Ukrainians will be able to attack in the direction of Kadema, and the Ukrainians, of course, will be able to attack in the direction of Klinova. And this is the most important bridgehead, not Klishchiivka. Klishchiivka is just the first stage to this area. When talking about the northern flank, the Ukrainians made more attempts to attack the Russian positions and so on. The Ukrainians reported that they managed to discover and to track the Russian air defense system Strela-10, and as a result of artillery strike, the Ukrainians managed to destroy that air defense system that probably during the previous months managed to shut down a lot of Ukrainian helicopters and Su-25 in this area, and a lot of drones, of course, as well. So the Ukrainians destroyed that air defense system. Furthermore, the Ukrainians continue bombing and shelling the Russian positions in Solidar as a part of preparation before the next greatest offensive of Ukraine operation in the direction of this settlement, and they destroyed the radar. From the other side, the Russians continue bombing and shelling the Ukrainians in the vicinity of Razdolovka. And for example, today, the Ukrainians, these days, maybe not today, maybe yesterday, the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack Russian positions in front of Razdolovka. And as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians managed to enter the trenches, to capture them, to establish small bridgehead. There is a very big video of battle for these trenches. But the Russians, after they managed to suppress Ukrainian artillery, after the Russians allowed the Ukrainians to enter the trenches, they sent their own, storming troopers with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to step back. As a result of that battle, the Ukrainians were defeated, and yet the Russians controls this defense belt in front of Razdolovka. The Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fightings on Donetsk front line, the Ukrainians lost 280 soldiers, 16 armored vehicles including 3 tanks and 6 artillery systems and 1 radar INT-PQ-36. When talking about Lyman front line, there are also very fierce fightings. The Ukrainians continue counterattacking, and for example, in the Kremenaya forest, the Ukrainians, as a result of a counterattack or drone attack or artillery attack, managed to destroy Russian tank. Some sources are claiming that the Ukrainians managed to destroy T-90, but I believe that that was just a regular T-64. The Russians managed to capture a few Ukrainian soldiers as a result of another storming operation in the vicinity of Dibroma. At least the Russian claims that they captured 4 Ukrainian soldiers, wounded Ukrainian soldiers. And of course, the Ukrainians continue using drone tactic to discover and to attack the Russian trucks that moves and goes, that brings some supply and support. On this video, we see how the Ukrainians discovered, tracked just a regular machine car and destroyed that car with a drone. The Russians published from their site video in the vicinity of Nevskaya, how they managed to discover and to destroy the Ukrainian armored vehicle, the Swedish armored vehicle being armored vehicle CV-90. Now we are moving probably to the second most important bridgehead during these days, and I'm talking about the small settlement by the name of Sergeyevka. Finally, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation confirmed that as a result of fierce fightings, as a result of crossing the river, Zherebets River operation, the Russians managed to develop significant bridgehead on the western side of Zherebets River, and today the Russians reported, the Minister of Defense, that the first settlement on this bridgehead was captured by the Russians, and we are talking about the small settlement Sergeyevka. This is not a very big settlement, maybe just 5-6 buildings, but anyway, this is the first area, the first settlement on this bank of Zherebets River, and this is the first settlement, official gains that were confirmed by the Minister of Defense. When talking about Novoyegorovka, as I understand, there are still fierce fightings, and Ukrainians do have access to some parts of the settlement, and currently the Russians continue clearing the operation, but I don't think that the Ukrainians are able to hold this bridgehead for a very long time. In a day or in a 2, the Russians will be able to defeat the Ukrainians and to establish 100% control over this part of the settlement and over the western part as well. The Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of fierce fightings on the Lyman front line, which includes the bridgehead in the vicinity of Karamzinovka, the Ukrainians lost 190 soldiers, 11 armored vehicles and 5 artillery systems and 1 radar INT-PQ-50. Probably this is the heaviest losses on this front line since the beginning of the special military operation. Yesterday the Ukrainians lost 195, today 190, so we see that there are very fierce battles, even much more powerful in comparison with South Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia area. And the final front line is Kupyansk and Kharkiv area. The Russians continue bombing and shelling the Ukrainians, their positions, their reserves, trying to freeze and pin down the Ukrainians. For example, today we got the video how the Russians destroyed another Ukrainian squad in the vicinity of the railroad ways, the forepost or the stronghold of the Ukrainians. It's a very important logistic area, and the Ukrainians understand if they can control this intersection of the railroad ways and the regular road, that means that they control the entire area in the vicinity of Berestovo, Klishchiivka and so on. The Russians discovered Ukrainian positions, and probably the Russians have already launched the beginning of the artillery preparation before another attempt to attack, or the first attempt to attack in this direction from Pershatravneva, because as I understand and expect that the Russians will also use this direction of attack during the next few days. When talking about the Kupyansk frontline, Kupyansk area, the Ukrainians discovered Russian positions in the forest between Dvoriechne, and they just were bombing and shilling them using artillery, and no, not even artillery, but another drone squad and drone part of 3rd Tank Brigade, as I understand, were trying to hunt the Russians in this area. From the other side, the Russians published another Lancet strike in this area. As a result of that attack, the Ukrainians lost the position of D-30 howitzer. So the D-30 howitzer was destroyed as a result of Lancet strike. Not so big target, but anyway. And of course the artillery duels, very heavy artillery duels between Kharkiv and Belgorod region. The Russian published another video of destroyed Ukrainian accumulation of the forces. The author of this video claims that Ukrainians have accumulated, maybe there was some kind of party, I don't know, but a lot of Ukrainians at one day visited one area. And the Russians are saying that there were around 50 soldiers visited this area. Maybe there was a real party or somebody's birthdays. You can see more and more vehicles and cars entering the forest. The Russians managed to discover that, and after that they launched significant strike with artillery, with rockets, with missiles. And according to the information we have, as a result of those attacks, the Russians managed to kill, and the Ukrainians lost around 50 soldiers. And the number of armored vehicles and just vehicles that Ukrainians lost is a known number, and now we're going to see like the bombings. So very heavy bombings of Ukrainian positions, just because of the fact that Ukrainians didn't make any things to hide their positions. So very stupid situation. And of course another video from Kharkiv area. The Russians discovered another Ukrainian positions in this small hangar barrack, and as a result of artillery strike or Lancet strike, the Russians managed to destroy also another Ukrainian positions with armored vehicles and munition. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.